Now, I don't know about you, but I just love it when a crazy idea that seems totally beyond what can be possible turns out to be something that can be done. And I love it even more if it goes beyond being just a proof of concept, but instead becomes something very useful. And that's precisely what I thought of the new Laowa 10mm f2.8 0D for full frame cameras. And in this video, let me tell you about my experience using it. Now, I clearly remember when I was starting out in photography, and it was my first time trying a 10 to 24mm lens. My mind was blown about how wide it was. It was just so not like the kit lens, which was at the time for me was amazing. And at the time, I probably didn't even understand the concept of full frame and APS-C. And I did not know that the 10mm back then were actually 16 because Canon, right? Weird crop factor. And then when I started shooting with full frame cameras, it was also the time when the norm was the 17 to 35. Then it became the 16 to 35. Then later on came the 15 to 30, which was probably one of my longest DSLR ultra-wide angle lenses, the one from Tamron. And then came the 12 to 24. You pretty much know that you're going to be getting distortion, depending on how wide it is and depending on who made it. But generally, anything that was going to be wider than 16mm would, of course, come with a lot of distortion, and you would just have to accept it or work your way around it. And that was around the time I was probably also thinking, what if we had a 10mm full frame? By the time I understood the concept of crop factor. Honestly, it's been a while since I've reviewed anything from Laowa. I think the last one I reviewed was the 20mm f4 shift, which I actually have been wanting still. So if you're not familiar with Laowa, Laowa or Venus Optics is actually a lens brand that chooses to go against the norm. When I first read about number one, I thought it was for APS-C. Because again, I did not expect anyone to make a lens like this. Then when I heard it's for full frame, I thought, well, maybe it's not 0D. Then I heard it was. Then I found out it has autofocus. So this is actually Laowa's first autofocus lens, which means that we might be expecting more autofocus ultra-wide angle lenses and maybe also macro lenses from Laowa, which would be amazing as well if that happens. And then when I finally took the time to read up about it, I knew I just had to test it out. Now let's first talk about the numbers. Okay, so again, 10mm f2.8, the aperture range is f2.8 to f22, which is pretty common. It has an angle of view of 130 degrees. So 10mm f2.8 all the way to 22. It weighs 420 grams and it is actually shorter than it is long. So the diameter is 82 millimeters, but the length is just 70 millimeters, which means that, well, for one, it's already very light. It's just 420 grams, not really anything you would think about whenever you're shooting. So 420 grams, and it is kept compact. Won't ever be front heavy. Your camera is probably heavier than this lens, which already broke my expectations. 10mm f2.8, I would have expected something huge. I would have expected something heavy. I would have expected something with a round front element and with no filter thread, but no. Now it's 10mm. I had my doubts about the filter thread. It might be just for show because you might have a vignette if you use a filter. But no, I was able to use filters on this. Of course, you're gonna have to use a wide angle adapter if you're using some square filters. But depending on how big and how thick the filters are, there are possibilities wherein you're shooting without any vignette, even if you're stacking maybe 2 or 3 filters. It also comes with a metal lens hood that is quite small, actually quite thin. And I understand that because again, 10 millimeters, if this were any longer, it would show up in frame. And it had to go a bit wider against the center so that it would not show up in frame as a vignette. As you probably can tell, even just the physical features already surprised me because this just goes against every expectation I had on this. Now, one last thing that blew my mind was that, okay, I now know, well, not really how they did it, but like the general idea of how they were able to do it. They made the barrel small. So as you can see, even if the entire lens is 82 millimeters, I mean the diameter, the glass element in front is actually a lot smaller. I haven't measured it, but it's just a bit a third of the entire diameter. And that allowed them to make it that wide, and that allowed them to make it not that heavy, and that allowed them to make it also be able to use filters. So totally not what I expected. I expected a much bigger one, a much heavier one. Now, when I was about to test this, my concern was, and this is not coming out of any knowledge on optical engineering or whatever. I thought if it's too small, then maybe it has its trade-off when it comes to the image quality. So I really had to test it. Now, for context, if you're new to the channel, I am a landscape photographer and an architectural and real estate photographer professionally. So wide-angle lenses are really up my alley. And, well, I would think that 10 millimeters would be too wide for some instances in landscape photography, which is why when this was going to be sent to me, I thought I'd be totally excited to try this out for real estate. Instead of using it for landscapes with wide vistas and everything like that, I expected this to be better for tight spaces. And believe me, one of the biggest problems I encounter when I'm shooting residential spaces is that sometimes they are just small. And that would mean that if you wanted to be able to get a lot of the details right, you're gonna need a wide-angle lens. Now, previously what I've been using would be a combination of my 16 to 35 GM or my 15 millimeter shift, and I would do a shift panorama. And then when I tried this, well, I started calling this lens the cheat code. Because number one, it has autofocus, meaning that it's literally the press of a button and it lessens the anxiety that I might miss focusing and I might end up effing it up. The cheat code. And then, aside from the autofocus, basically what I was getting with the 10 millimeter is pretty close to the output of what I would get if I would do a shift panorama with the 15 millimeter. Take away a few millimeters, but very, very close. Which means that it saved me a lot of time processing and stitching photos because it's 10 millimeters, it's 130 degrees. The cheat code. I'm calling it the cheat code because it made the workflow so much easier, so much faster, and also with a lot more assurance because autofocus. I mean, you can be purist as heck as you want, but if you're doing a professional job and you can afford a bit of assurance, you can afford a bit of efficiency as well, autofocus is your friend. 10 millimeters, autofocus, and yes, zero distortion. Now, the 0D part, I would have to make a disclaimer. If, for example, you are using it at f2.8 and you're focusing at something really, really close, then you would expect a bit of distortion because it would also be different when it comes to the different glass elements inside the lens. It can also focus at 12 centimeters. That's 4.7 inches. Now, you wouldn't really call it a macro lens, but it does have a magnification of 1:4 because of that minimum focusing distance. So that's also something to consider. If you're planning to use this for nature, for landscapes, you can use this for focus stacking if you want a really hyper detailed landscape shot. But for the purpose of this review, I wanted to test it out for shooting real estate and interiors, basically. When I'm focusing a bit further away, and of course I would be shooting with a smaller aperture, tested it f8, f11, f16. For some reason, f14 was where I would get the most detail. I don't know if that's something applicable to most of the copies of this lens, but for this particular one, f14 is where I saw the best detail. Now, all of that being said, let's talk about the implications. Where can you use this? As I always say, lenses are not really made for just one purpose. If you're creative enough, you can even use a lens that wasn't really made for a certain thing to be used on that particular thing, and it might actually lead to something remarkable. For example, of course, wide angle. A lot of people thought this would be good with real estate and architecture. I do agree. If you're going to use this with exteriors and you're not using a shift lens, you're going to have to be cautious about camera height, because if you're not able to elevate the camera height properly, then you're going to get way too much foreground. Now, you can crop that, that is a fix, but another way is to climb a ladder or scaffolding or whatever. Look for the right camera height to get the right angle if you're shooting exteriors with this. For interiors as well, you also have to be cautious when it comes to the ceiling, because this actually does really well if you're shooting something with relatively low ceiling. If you're shooting a grand hall, same thing, you're gonna have to look for a way to get significant camera height. Now, that's just based on my opinion, because also that is based on my personal take on visual design and composition. But the tendency is there would be a bit of an imbalance when it comes to negative spaces or the details that you have on the floor or the ceiling. When it comes to landscapes, of course, it is usable, but again, it is a prime lens, which means that this is going to be the widest lens you're ever going to use. And zero distortion might not really mean much to you if you're shooting outdoors. But you know, if it's something that fits your artistic vision, then definitely this is useful. And it is also f2.8, which means that you can also use this for nighttime landscapes and get a bit of the night sky. Now, for everything else, is it usable for video? Definitely. It has autofocus. If you're using a camera with good AF tracking, it will do its job. Can you use it for portraits? If you're creative enough, why not? At the same time, what I liked is, okay, if I don't really need 10mm and I don't want to switch lenses, I can just use crop mode. And then the 10mm would be 15mm, and if that's what fits my vision, then that's all I need. And these photos from a recent residential condominium interior shoot, actually, I switched between using it as a full frame 10mm and an APS-C 15mm equivalent. Yes, again, overall, this definitely broke all my expectations. When I started hinting about this in my social media stories, there were people asking for the price, and some of them were surprised because they thought it was too high. Some of them were surprised because they thought it was too low. The former set of people actually probably did not know that it is autofocus. But if you're going to ask me, the price that it's being sold for, with the fact that, with everything it can do, especially the fact that it has autofocus, I think is actually very reasonable. Honestly, for me, purchasing this is a no-brainer because, again, it made my workflow very easy when I'm shooting interiors, and at the same time, when I need to shoot 360 panoramas, this also lessened the number of shots that I'd have to take because it's a huge jump from 16mm, and it can be held so much better by the gimbal. So the price it's selling for, and I'm not mentioning it because it's also different from country to country, and I will put down the link, of course, so you can check. But the price in general, it's less than $1,000 US, and that's very reasonable for me. Yes. So this is the Laowa 10mm f2.8 0D AF. I'd like to call it the Laowa wide AF, or the Laowa 10mm wide AF, because it is wide as, you get what I'm saying. Alternatively, I call this the cheat code, if you're using it in the proper situations.